Hello Isopod fans, this is Wally with Supreme Gecko. I have an Isopod question for you today. Are you getting no babies from your Isopod cultures? You've had them for months and months and still don't see any babies. Do you have less babies than you would expect? Well, I have 4 experts here today that are going to help you with that problem. We have a really special treat today. I mentioned that we have 4 Isopod experts here today to answer your question, but actually they're going to help me with my question as well. The other day I went into my Isopod enclosure for Armadillidium maculatum zebras, and I was kind of surprised that there weren't more babies in this enclosure. I was really surprised. I lifted up the cork bark, I lifted up the bark, and the adults were doing great, but there just wasn't that many babies, as many babies as I expected. The culture looked really good. Everything was in place just like I've had other Isopod enclosures. There was one special addition to this culture though, and that was dwarf whites. There were many dwarf whites down in the sphagnum moss, in the substrate, and it just posed the question to me, could the dwarf whites be impacting the number of babies that I'm getting from these Armadillidium maculatum zebras? Well, I thought it might be an issue, so I went to the experts to ask their opinion as well. Our first guest is Rachel Schindler-Beach from Pet Peds and Pods. She's been doing isopods for a long time, answers a lot of questions on the forums, and is, in my mind, an expert in isopods. Let's go ahead and bring Rachel on. Hi Rachel, I have a question for you. Do you think that dwarf whites in another isopod enclosure could impact the number of babies you get from those other isopods?
Hi Wally. So I really don't recommend keeping dwarf white isopods, or any dwarf isopods for that matter, in with other isopod cultures. The dwarf whites just reproduce so fast, and they will outcompete any other isopod for food and any of the resources that are in that bin. So I really don't recommend keeping them together at all.
Thanks, Rachel. I have a follow-up question if you don't mind. What do you do with those dwarf whites and other isopods? How do you separate them out then?
Yeah, so to separate out dwarf whites from your existing isopods, if you do have them together, you're going to want to remove all of the isopods that are not dwarf whites from that culture and put them in a completely new, fresh bin or whatever you're using for them. Don't try to remove the dwarf whites out because you'll never get them all. So take all of the isopods that you want to have separate from the dwarf whites. Don't move any substrate. Don't move any wood, leaves, bark, anything like that, food sources. Just take the isopods and put them in a nice, fresh bin.
Rachel, this is great information. Thank you very much for helping out, and I really appreciate it. Next up, I was fortunate enough to be at the Show Me Reptile Show in Janesville, Wisconsin this weekend, and I had 2 isopod experts there, Brittany Wetland from the Isopod Chick and Red Gunther from Red's Bugs, both experts in isopod care, and I had the opportunity to get them to the side when they weren't busy, they were busy all the time, and ask them the same question. So I'm here at the Show Me Reptile Show, and I have Brittany and the Isopod Chick, and I have a question for Brittany. This deals with dwarf whites. Brittany, have you ever kept dwarf whites with other isopods, and what's your feeling on that?
I didn't purposely keep them with other ones, but they escaped into other bins like they often do. And I noticed that when they do, that culture tends to, over time, pretty much die off. So my opinion would be to not keep them together because the other culture tends to die off and the whites still thrive.
So we all know that keeping different isopods are probably not a good thing, especially like dairy cows with rubber duckies isn't a good thing, because ultimately the dairy cows will, is predate a good word or maybe too strong of a word, but ultimately the dairy cows or powder blues or some other isopod like that will overtake that colony, right?
Yes.
And your thought is that actually dwarf whites might actually do the same thing.
I do. I fully believe that because, throughout time I was told that, a species that is above substrate and below substrate can go together. But I've noticed when they do that culture tends to just slow down over time.
Exactly. So you have something like a zebra on top and a dwarf white in the substrate, actually burrowing into the substrate. So they never should really interfere with each other, right?
So they say.
So they say.
Yeah.
But I think there's some other thoughts that that's not true, and you've had experiences where you've actually seen less production from your other isopods when you have dwarf whites in the same
yeah.
container.
So now whenever I catch them in another bin, I have to fully take out the above substrate isopods and put them in a different bin.
You don't individually pick the dwarf whites out and transfer.
No.
I'm here at the Show Me Reptile Show with Red Gunther, Red's Bugs, one of the best sites to find isopods, one of the most knowledgeable isopod keepers out there. And I've got a question for you, Red.
Okay, I got an answer for you,
All
Wally.
right, we'll try this. So, do you keep dwarf whites with your isopods?
Yes.
How does that work for you?
For the last 5 years, I have not had any noticeable issues.
Excellent. So do you keep them with all varieties of isopods? Do you keep your dwarf whites with other isopods, from the giant Spanish to your rubber duckies to your zebras?
So I didn't do it on purpose, but it happened. So not all of my species have them. My rubber duckies do not. My bolivari do. My expansus do. My magnificus do. Powder orange, powder blue. A very wide variety.
Perfect. Is there some isopods that you would not ever mix with dwarf whites with that isopod?
My personal opinion is if you can keep them separated, it would be best. I have not noticed any downside to it. There is some thoughts that the dwarf whites, if they were out, if the population was very large, that they would go after the young isopods, if that makes sense.
Excellent. And it makes absolute sense. And you're kind of confirming that you've had no problems whatsoever with that.
No noticeable problems.
No noticeable problems. Excellent. Excellent. Perfect. This is great. This adds to the whole collection of this information, and I want to keep moving forward with kind of the expert's look into some of these tough questions.
Yes.
Thanks, Red.
Thank you, Wally.
Next up, we have Russ Wilson from Aquarimax Pets, and I pulled him away from his very, very busy schedule and asked him the same question. Hey, Russ, do you think that keeping dwarf whites with other isopods is a problem?
Well, Wally, that's a great question, and my short answer is I would not advise it. My long answer is I've seen it become a problem. I have seen dwarf whites outcompete other species. It's not something that happens overnight, but it happens gradually, but it does happen. And this is basically a case of the mutual exclusion principle, in which two species occupying the same niche with a finite resources, basically they're competing until one is going to gain advantage over the other. And that I've seen it happen. It will probably happen in most cases. There may be some species that can make it work, but I don't think it's a good idea to put them together on purpose, definitely.
I see. So if dwarf whites with other isopods is a problem, how do you solve that problem then, Russ?
Well, Wally, something I've done is I've taken the species I want to save out of the bin, just the adults and larger juveniles, so that they're easy to distinguish from the dwarf whites, put them into a temporary container with just damp paper toweling, scrutinize them carefully with a magnifying glass to make sure there are no tiny dwarf whites clinging to them or anything like that, and then moving them to a pristine bin with none of the substrate from that previous bin. That has worked for me in the past. I would say think about husbandry. Make sure that your protocols for transference of dwarf whites is kind of sharpened. Keep the dwarf whites away from other isopods in the future. Make sure to wash your hands under your fingernails and everything if you're working in a dwarf white bin, and then go to work in another bin, just to eliminate the possibility of contamination as much as possible. Don't keep your dwarf white bins above others either. That can help. And just one suggestion from Oren McMonigal on this topic. In his book Isopod Zoology, he mentions that you can take a cold hardy colony, say Porcellio scabra for example, that's been infested with the dwarf whites, put that colony into a refrigerator overnight. The dwarf whites can't handle the cold, Porcellio scabra can. Not something you'd want to do with rubber duckies, but for a lot of the cold hardy species, it seems like it could work. Personally, I've never tried it.
That sounds like a great solution. Thanks, Russ. Thanks for helping us out. Some great suggestions there, folks. Some feel that it is a definite problem. Some feel that it might be a problem, and some feel that it hasn't been a problem for them. Personally, I don't know. I don't know in my own collection if it's a problem or not. I'm guessing that it might be. I tell you what I am going to do though is I'm going to pull any of my isopods away from the dwarf whites. Great suggestions for how to do that here in this video, and I'm going to keep them separate just to give those baby isopods a chance against some dwarf whites. I want to see my isopods, like the zebras and clowns, do as best as they possibly can, and I also want to have a good, healthy culture of dwarf whites. If you're keeping dwarf whites and want to know more about keeping dwarf whites better, I've got a video for you that you can watch right up here. Make sure you click that video so you get more information on dwarf whites. I hope this information helped you. Best of luck with your dwarf white and isopods, and thank you very much for watching.